Okay, hopefully getting your brain warmed up and reviewing the entire semester because, as hopefully you can see by now, it is all related. It's like Inception. So, the scramble for Africa, remember that took place in the 1880s, where we have all of these European countries all of a sudden trying to claim the various territories in Africa. And a lot of that happens at the Berlin Conference. We saw that Britain gains the most territory, essentially a column from Cape Town to Cairo, as we saw in the cartoon with Cecil Rhodes. They're able to get the most because they have the most power, they have the most resources to expend in getting an empire. Then we have France in second place. They gained a lot of the northwest portion of the continent, which includes a lot of the Sahara Desert, but northern Africa for the most part. And some of the resources that these European nations wanted, you could say they wanted ports, they wanted a place as a stopover to get to Eastern Asia, diamonds, ivory, gold, um, copper, rubber, and oil. So even though the Second World War is decades and decades later, these countries are still fighting over some of the same issues because history is sort of a continuum. These countries have long held rivalries that will continue to be an issue even into the 1940s. So that takes us to the North African campaign. This is one of the earliest battles, or the start of the earliest battles in the war, following the progression of aggression and the end of Sitzkrieg. Again, it really is a fight for the resources. At this point, oil, because just like we saw with Stalingrad, the need for oil in mechanized modern warfare. If you don't have oil, you can't propel your tanks or your planes or your trucks or your battleships. Oil is essential, and there's plenty of it in North Africa. If you think of where the empires were in the 1800s, Britain controlled Egypt, and France controlled essentially everything else. And as of 1940, France has been controlled by the Nazis. So therefore, most of North Africa is controlled by the Nazis. In addition to simply that territory and the resources, we have the Suez Canal that connects the Med to the Red. So they're fighting over all of these things. Some of the people who are involved from Britain, we have Bernard Montgomery, or Monty, down at the top. On the lower left, you have George S. Patton, the American. This is the first place where Americans will really be in combat because we only get involved as of December 7th, 1941. This is the first place where American soldiers will go. The Americans and the British, or we'll call them the Allies, they are fighting against German Erwin Rommel, or the Desert Fox as he's called. He's very uncanny, he's very stealthy in his battle plans. So this goes on for a few years. The largest battle in this campaign is the Battle of El Alamein. It's significant because, as Churchill said, before Alamein, the Allies never had any real victories, a clear win in battle. And after Alamein, they really only had victories. There's a few issues here and there, but this is a turning point of the war. Geographically, it's also very, very important. Once the Allies can control northern Africa, it means it is then possible to get into the heart of Europe. So in addition to the resources and control of the Suez Canal, the Allies want to control northern Africa so that they have a jumping off place to get into the heart of the continent. Now, if you look at this, now the first place it would make is the easiest way to get from North Africa to the continent would be at Gibraltar, next to Spain. But Spain officially is a neutral nation. So the Allies will not be able to invade Spain. Second most likely place would be Italy, from Tunisia to Sicily. Even Churchill said, a child using an atlas would be able to tell that an invasion would happen at Sicily in Italy. However, the British used their uncanny sense of false intelligence to create a different plan. So those of you who watched the information about Operation Mincemeat, this is what the plan was. They wanted to convince the Germans and Italians that the invasion would actually take place in Greece. So what the British intelligence services do is they find a homeless man, a dead body, and they create a personality. They put false intelligence on his person, make it look like he crashed over the waters near Spain. And when that body floats up, the Spanish who are sympathetic to the Germans would report the information to the Germans. It is so convincing that the Germans buy it. So that means that the Germans are focusing their attention on Greece. They are moving some of their resources and manpower over to Greece because that's where they expect the invasion to take place. Now, that's not where it will take place. That's exactly what they wanted the Germans to think. The invasion will take place in Sicily, and it begins in July 1943. So it took all of that time to get northern Africa and then have a place from which to launch the invasion into Europe. They'll have to get Sicily and then the rest of Italy, and it really does become village by village. Now, the Italians were part of the Axis, but they, for the most part, are the puppets of the Germans. So part of the reason for this campaign is to continue to keep German forces occupied in the south of Europe. That will make sense in just a second. As these Allied forces, both American and British, make their way through Italy, it really is village by village, church by church, street by street, and civilians are caught in the middle of it. Some of these beautiful works of art are being threatened. So we have civilians protecting the walls of the church in Milan where Da Vinci's Last Supper is. It takes nearly 2 years for the Allies to fully gain control of Italy. It was an important part of winning back territory from the totalitarian dictatorships. It also was important to make sure that German troops are kept occupied to distract from really the major invasion that would be taking place in the north, or what we'll call the Western Front, or even the European theater. So this takes us to Operation Overlord. Again, looking at the map, it would make the most sense that an invasion from England onto the continent would happen at the Dover-Calais Pass. We've talked about this before with the Tale of Two Cities. That was the shortest distance on the English Channel, about 21 miles. The British want the Germans to believe that the invasion will take place here at Calais. They do this through more false intelligence, where the real invasion will happen is a little bit southwest on the coast of Normandy. But it is important that the British especially continue to feed information. So this is those of you who watched the Double Cross. We have double agents who are feeding false information to the Germans. And there's even another level of deception using illusions. And you can watch a video about the magician Jasper Maskelyne. All of this is leading up to D-Day, what we now call as D-Day, June 6, 1944. Now, D-Day simply is the term for the beginning date of any operation. Originally, D-Day, in this case, was scheduled for June 5th, but the weather wasn't cooperating, so they had to wait till the weather was the right conditions. Again, British and Americans. In this case, the British includes Canadians. So we essentially have 3 different countries waiting to invade France from Britain. The Germans had been waiting for this. They had set up defenses years ago, you see in the green line. So that means that there's a series of bunkers all along the coast, because the Germans never knew where would the invasion take place or when would it take place. So the bunkers are already in place, but that's why it's so important that the German troops were sort of separated and distracted to the Calais crossing, and also that they were continuing to fight in Italy. This will be an amphibious invasion, meaning water to land. And General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the American, will be the general in charge. Now, because this was such a big undertaking, if it was done by committee, things probably wouldn't have worked very smoothly. So it's important to have a single leader. And he writes this letter. He sends it, he makes copies, and he also records it for all of the men who are going to be a part of this invasion, because this was a big deal. This is finally the chance to take back Europe, to free it from the tyrannical rule of the Nazis. Eisenhower also had a second letter in his pocket just in case it failed, because even though the Allies had been training and preparing for this for years, there was no guarantee it was going to succeed. So here's a very famous photograph of the Normandy landings. It took about 7 or 8 hours just to get from the coast of Britain close enough to Normandy. Then troops would enter these landing vessels, and it's probably about half the size of our classroom. And they couldn't get all the way up to the beach because the Germans had set out barriers called hedgehogs, these giant metal, almost X's that made it impossible for boats to be able to get up to the shoreline. So these boats would have to lower their doors, and sometimes soldiers would fall into the water, and the weight of their packs was so heavy that they would drown, or they might be shot immediately, because as you can sort of see the outline of a cliff, that's where that Atlantic wall, that system of bunkers, has been established. So these soldiers need to get across this entire beach, and it's a very deep beach. It's probably deeper than Zuma is for us. Then you have these steep cliffs that already have defenses built into it. So here is a modern picture of these beaches. These cliffs aren't as high. This is at Utah Beach, which is one of the beaches where the Americans were. But it was really quite a feat that these 155,000 soldiers made it onto the beach. And then there are certain areas of the coastline that are just cliff walls. So the soldiers had to scale the cliff walls first before they could try and take over the German bunkers. So here again we have Eisenhower talking to troops, and in this case these are paratroopers. So we have the amphibious portion, but then the other part of this attack are the paratroopers who are going to drop in over France hours before the amphibious part. So these parachutists are going to drop in over Normandy at about 2 a.m. So this is what it would have looked like if we could see it during the day. We have all of these parachutes. From America, we have the 82nd and the 101st Airborne, in addition to British paratroopers. And you can't perfectly land a parachute if you are at the whim of nature, of the wind, of the height from where you dropped. So all of these soldiers then are scattered once they land. They had been looking at maps. They know where they're supposed to be, but once they land, they don't know where they are. So they're going to have to work together to find other Allied troops and figure out where on earth are they. What road am I on? And then to add to the problem, there's these really giant hedgerows that the soldiers couldn't get through that made it difficult. So on June 6th, there is quite significant loss of life, both for civilians and soldiers. Again, it is Army, sailors, paratroopers. This is a massive, massive undertaking, but it's worth it. Even with the loss of life, this is the result, that by the end of the day, the Allies control the beachhead and are able to then sail up right up to the beach, start unloading tanks, start unloading more and more troops and jeeps to begin taking back Europe from Hitler's power. About 8% of Allied soldiers were killed that day, which is significant, but it really is worth it. Then we have the civilians. I mean, this was occupied territory. People lived in these villages and ended up being caught right in the middle of a war zone. By July 4th, so 1 month after D-Day, 1 million Allied soldiers are on the ground in France. By the middle of August 1944, nearly 2 million Allied soldiers are on the ground, and they're making their way all the way across France, and the goal is to get to Paris. Now, Hitler loved Paris, and maybe it was the art student in him. But as he realizes that he must retreat, he gave the order to bomb the city, to destroy it, to level it. And luckily, the German commanders couldn't bring themselves to do it. They thought Paris was just too beautiful. And so thankfully, we still have all of these monuments, and the returning Allied forces and the Free France forces, who had been in exile for 4 years, are able to march through the Arc de Triomphe. And 4 years later, Hitler's troops had just marched through there. So this is pretty significant. Operation Overlord's goal was to take back Paris, to cross the Seine River. So it has been a success. The next part of the plan, then, is to get to Germany. So to get to Germany is the next part of the plan, and they will try that with Operation Market Garden in September 1944. Because the air assault had been rather successful at Normandy, they decide to try it again in the Netherlands, to drop in a number of paratroopers whose job it is to secure bridges and roads, which would then allow the tanks to roll through the Netherlands into Germany. However, they estimated incorrectly. They didn't have enough people to make it work, so the Allies are forced to retreat and come up with a new plan. And that will lead to the Battle of the Bulge. Now, the Allies, the British and the Americans, have control of France, so they start to gradually work their way into Belgium. And this battle happens right as this is happening. As the British and Americans are trying to work their way through Belgium, they'll get stuck in the Ardennes Forest, which is right there in the south. The Germans desperately did not want the Allies to cross into German territory. So the Germans go on the offensive. They want to separate the British from the Americans, make it difficult to coordinate, to cut off their supply lines, all of that. And this is where we get the Bulge issue. Is it this attack by the Germans sort of creates this lump into the Allied forces. And down near Bastogne, we have an entire section of the American army completely cut off. Now this is in winter, in the middle of the forest, and it means that if it's winter, it's snowing, and the Allied planes are unable to provide cover, meaning they're not able to see the German army in order to attack them. So here you see it really is soldiers in a forest. They were digging foxholes and praying for a miracle, hoping that the Germans would run out of supplies. And the Germans were already running low, but at least with the cloud cover, they had an advantage on the Allies. But when the weather breaks, then the planes are able to come back over to attack the Germans and cut them off from their supply lines. So in the end, it is a success for the Allies, and the British and Americans are able to walk into Germany and finally get back to reclaiming Europe.